Imagine waking up not in your cozy modern bed, but in a sweltering shack in the Caribbean, where the air is thick with rum, sweat, and the faint smell of death, and you know deep down that the world you've stumbled into is about to turn history upside down. That's where our story begins, in the chaotic years after 1713, when the War of the Spanish Succession ended, and suddenly thousands of the world's most skilled sailors, men who had once been armed with government permission to plunder enemy ships as privateers, were dumped unceremoniously into unemployment. Think about that for a second. 36,000 hardened fighters, men trained in violence, navigation and boarding tactics, now left to starve on the docks of London, Bristol, and beyond. What do you think happens when you give a starving wolf back its teeth? That's right, piracy exploded, and not in some romantic swashbuckling way, but in a desperate, chaotic eruption that would change the Atlantic world forever. Step with me into Nassau, 1715, a place that barely deserved to be called a town, nothing more than the skeletal ruins of old buildings overtaken by vines after being abandoned by the British. Yet in those rotting timbers and burned-out shells, a new society was forming, one governed by no king, no parliament, no law, only the Articles of Agreement, the Pirate Code, which gave every man a vote, every man a share, and every man a reason to fight. It was here that you could open your eyes and see figures you'll recognize, though perhaps not as the legends they would become. Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, yes, the man who would become Blackbeard, but who at this moment was still just a tall, broad-shouldered ex-privateer with an unkempt dark beard. Charles Vane, already infamous for his cruelty, and Samuel Black Sam Bellamy, a pirate with a rare reputation for restraint. Can you picture it? You're lying in a salt-crusted hammock, head pounding from last night's cheap rum, when Hornigold himself kicks at your feet and barks that the tide is coming, and so are the Spanish ships, 2 of them loaded with goods and lightly defended. The men around you spring to life faster than any navy whip could make them, not from fear but from hunger for plunder. And outside, Nassau is nothing but a wreck reclaimed by outlaws, its burned shells now echoing with the laughter, schemes, and drunken songs of those who had nothing left to lose. As you stumble toward the beach with the others, you catch whispers. Teach is sailing today, and though he's not yet Blackbeard, his reputation is already spreading. And then, as if summoned by whispers alone, a small sloop comes tacking into the harbor, carrying not 1 but 3 men whose names alone could spark an inferno among pirates. Charles Vane in his red coat, Samuel Bellamy with his black ribbons, and a strange gentlemanly figure who looks more suited for plantation dinners than for blood-soaked decks. Sted Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate. They bring news that makes every man's heart pound faster than a cannon in battle. The Spanish treasure fleet, 11 galleons heavy with silver and gold, has wrecked off the coast of Florida in a hurricane. Imagine hearing that. Imagine someone telling you that the very dream of piracy, untold riches sitting practically unguarded on the beach, was suddenly real. Hornigold calls a vote, and without hesitation, the men decide to seize the opportunity. Blackbeard takes command of a ship, Vane another, Bellamy a third. You're swept up in the frenzy, assigned to the Revenge under Teach himself, and just like that, your fate is sealed. As you climb aboard, you notice something strange. Despite their lawless reputation, pirates work with astonishing efficiency. There are no lashes, no screams of a bosun's whip, only men who know their survival depends on cooperation, who want to work because the treasure at the end belongs to them. You're handed a swivel gun and told how to load grape shot, tiny iron balls that tear through enemy decks like a devil's shotgun. And suddenly you realize that you are not just a bystander, you are about to become a participant in history. The fleet sails, 5 ships, 300 men, bound for the Florida coast, and when you arrive, the sight is haunting. Broken Spanish galleons scattered like bones across the reefs, the bodies of drowned sailors littering the sands. And there, just as Bonnet described, a guardhouse protecting crates of silver, 350,000 pieces of 8, guarded by 60 Spaniards. Blackbeard raises a flag, not yet the infamous skull with an hourglass, but a skeletal figure stabbing a heart. The Spanish fire cannons nervously, their shots splashing into the surf, but Blackbeard orders measured volleys in return, creating panic without risking the prize. Then the longboats go in, with Teach himself at the front, beard flying, sword raised, and because this is Teach after all, hurling a lit bottle of gunpowder that explodes into fire against the guardhouse. Within an hour, the Spaniards are broken, the black flag is raised, and the treasure is theirs, yours. Can you even imagine what it felt like? Silver coins clinking in your hands, more wealth than you could ever hope to earn in decades of honest work, divided fairly according to the articles. For a moment, Nassau erupts in celebrations so wild you might almost forget that this act has lit a fuse that will burn all the way to the downfall of the pirate republic. But for now, there is only rum, laughter, and the intoxicating belief that you and your fellow outcasts have cheated the world. In that moment, standing on the beach as silver is carried to the ships, you can almost convince yourself that you are not criminals, but free men. And here's where I'll break the wall to remind you, if you're picturing this as a glamorous Disney ride with jaunty music, stop right there. These men were killers, thieves, and outlaws, but they were also visionaries in their own twisted way, building a society that answered to no king, no empire, no church. The raid on the Spanish fleet was not just a theft, it was the opening shot in the creation of the pirate republic, the boldest experiment in outlaw democracy the Caribbean would ever see. And though you and I both know it won't last, for them, in that rum-soaked summer of 1715, it felt eternal. It felt like destiny. The thing about legends is they don't arrive fully formed. They are built piece by piece, choice by choice, until one day you wake up, and the man you once knew has been replaced by a myth. And that's exactly what happened to Edward Teach. Months after the Spanish treasure raid, Nassau was thriving, swollen with taverns, brothels, and swaggering outlaws drunk on silver. But cracks were forming, because while Benjamin Hornigold clung to his scruples, refusing to attack English ships as if his old privateer's commission still meant something, Teach was already changing, already deciding that loyalty to any flag but his own was weakness. You might have noticed it, too, in the way he began experimenting with theatrics, weaving slow-burning matches into his beard, and practicing how he looked in a mirror, the way smoke curled around his face like a demon risen from the sea. And if you were in Nassau long enough, you'd hear whispers that he was taking prizes and leaving no survivors, building not just wealth but fear. So when the inevitable split came between Hornigold and Teach, you weren't surprised. Teach gathered 40 men, christened a small sloop Adventure, and offered you a place. And what choice did you really have? Silver drains quickly in Nassau's taverns, and besides, refusing Teach was not just rude, it was dangerous. So you boarded, and the Adventure slipped into the blue Caribbean, faster and deadlier than most merchant ships could hope to be. The first capture was almost anticlimactic. A Dutch merchantman, its crew already unnerved by the sight of smoke curling from Teach's beard, surrendered without a fight after a single warning shot. You stood there stunned, wondering why it felt so easy, and then Teach explained. Terror, he said with that dark glint in his eye, was the strongest weapon a pirate could wield. That was the birth of Blackbeard. From then on, every capture was a stage play, a performance of smoke, fire, and fury. He'd strap pistols across his chest until he jangled like an arsenal. He'd growl like something inhuman, and always he'd let survivors go so they could carry his legend across the seas. Soon enough, merchantmen were surrendering at the mere sight of his flag, a skeleton stabbing a heart while clutching an hourglass, time itself dripping away. And if you're thinking this all sounds theatrical, you're right. But remember, fear wins battles without bloodshed, and Blackbeard knew it better than anyone. But ambition is a hungry beast, and by the time you limped back to Nassau with plundered sugar, cocoa, and tobacco, Blackbeard wanted more, something larger, something that would cement him as king of the seas. That's when the opportunity arrived. The massive French slave ship La Concorde, weakened by disease and exhaustion after the Atlantic crossing, its crew gaunt and half dead. You were there when Blackbeard raised his flag, and the French captain, seeing no hope, surrendered without a single cannon fired. And you were there when the stench of death in the hold nearly knocked you off your feet, hundreds of enslaved Africans chained and wasting away. Blackbeard, practical as ever, ordered them freed, not out of mercy but out of self-preservation. Disease was the last thing he wanted aboard his ship. The vessel itself, though, was perfect. 300 tons, 26 guns, a fortress on the water. Blackbeard renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a title dripping with irony, a statement of vengeance against the empire that had cast him and his kind aside after Queen Anne's War. He cut extra gun ports, mounted 40 cannons, and suddenly the seas had a floating monster. Picture it, 4 ships, over 300 men, drilling with cannons, sharpening cutlasses, singing shanties at night, while their captain stalked the deck like a shadow, with smoke always smoldering from his beard, even when there was no enemy in sight. If you were aboard then, you would have felt it too, the sense that this wasn't just piracy anymore, this was a kingdom rising on the waves. And Blackbeard proved it when he did something no pirate had dared before. He blockaded Charleston, the richest port in the American colonies. With Queen Anne's Revenge at the harbor's mouth, nothing could get in or out, and panic set in. Prices soared, merchants begged for mercy, and then Blackbeard revealed his demand. Not gold, not jewels, but medicine for his men, remedies for syphilis and disease. Think about that for a moment. He held a city hostage, not for treasure, but for a chest of drugs. Some say it was practicality, others say it was showmanship, proving he could choke a colony into submission without firing a broadside. Either way, Charleston capitulated, and Blackbeard released the hostages, smiling like a man who knew he'd just carved his name into history. But let's break the fourth wall here, because you might be wondering, was this still piracy, or had it become something else entirely? Even the men aboard weren't sure anymore. Some muttered that it felt wrong, terrorizing civilians rather than fighting naval ships. Others feared Blackbeard himself, that the line between man and monster was blurring too far. And perhaps they were right, because not long after, Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground on a sandbar near Beaufort, North Carolina, and some whispered it wasn't an accident at all. Maybe Blackbeard wanted to rid himself of surplus men, keep the best loot for himself, and slip away into a quieter deal with Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina, who was only too willing to look the other way in exchange for bribes. By then, Blackbeard was the most famous outlaw alive, and bounties on his head reached sums no pirate had ever seen. 500 pounds dead or alive, enough to make betrayal tempting for anyone. But here's the thing about stories like this. The higher a man climbs, the harder the fall, and though Blackbeard strutted with smoke and steel, deep down even he must have known the Empire would not tolerate a pirate kingdom forever. The clock was ticking, the noose tightening, and yet on the decks of Queen Anne's Revenge, with the cannons polished and the black flag snapping in the wind, it felt for a moment like the pirates had already won. If part 1 was about the birth of the Pirate Republic, and part 2 about the making of Blackbeard the legend. Then part 3 is about the inevitable truth of every outlaw story. The empire always strikes back, and those who once lived like kings are hunted until nothing remains but whispers and bones. After the Charleston blockade, Blackbeard was both unstoppable and doomed. He had humiliated a major colonial port without spilling more than a drop of blood, but in doing so, he painted the biggest possible target on his back. The governors of Virginia and South Carolina spat out proclamations of vengeance. The bounty on his head swelled, and Woodes Rogers, the new governor of the Bahamas, made it his personal mission to exterminate Nassau's pirate republic. Even Nassau itself, once a ramshackle den of thieves that had blossomed into a booming outlaw town, began to crumble as pardons were offered and once proud pirates slunk back into obedience. Hornigold, the old mentor, accepted a pardon. Even Charles Vane briefly bent before trying to escape again. The dream of a pirate utopia was dying, not with a dramatic battle, but with the slow poison of compromise. Blackbeard, meanwhile, seemed to sense his own end coming. He had run Queen Anne's Revenge aground, whether by accident or design, and taken his best men north to North Carolina, cutting deals with Governor Eden to secure a temporary sanctuary. In exchange for bribes and a share of plunder, Eden issued legitimate trading papers that gave Blackbeard a thin veneer of respectability. But everyone knew it was a lie, and you could almost feel the clock ticking in the humid air of Ocracoke Inlet, where Blackbeard anchored, restless and uneasy. The man who once lived for terror now spent hours in his cabin staring at maps as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. And then it came. The betrayal. The thing he must have known was inevitable. In November 1718, Virginia's governor dispatched Lieutenant Robert Maynard to hunt him down with 2 sloops, and the stage was set for one of the bloodiest finales in pirate history. At dawn, the British crept into Ocracoke. Blackbeard, ever theatrical, ordered his men to prepare, and the battle erupted in thunder. Cannon fire shattered the air, smoke rolled across the deck, and when the grappling hooks clanged, Blackbeard himself charged forward, pistols blazing, cutlass swinging, his beard lit with slow matches, so he looked less like a man than the very devil sailors had whispered about for years. Eyewitnesses said he fought like 10 men, taking 5 shots and 20 cuts before finally collapsing under the weight of sheer numbers. And when his head was hacked off and hung from Maynard's bowsprit, it was not just the death of a man, but the symbolic end of the Pirate Republic's boldest dream. You can almost hear the silence that followed, the hush when outlaws who once felt immortal realized they were suddenly prey. Yet piracy didn't vanish overnight, and this is where history gets deliciously strange, because while Blackbeard's severed head swung as a warning, 2 women were rewriting the rules in a way no one saw coming. Picture Nassau under Woodes Rogers, supposedly cleaned up, the taverns quieter, the brothels hidden, the wild days over, or so it seemed. In one of those taverns, the Spyglass. You might have seen her, Anne Bonny, Irish-born, fiery-haired, sharp-tongued, pretending to be just another barmaid while secretly sailing with Calico Jack Rackham. And by her side, or disguised among his crew, was Mary Red, the soldier-turned-pirate, who spent much of her life passing as a man. Together they carved their own legend, cutting through the Caribbean in Rackham's sloop, Anne fighting openly as a woman, Mary fighting disguised, until the truth inevitably slipped free. Imagine the shock of hardened sailors realizing the fiercest blade beside them belonged to someone society said had no place on a deck. Anne and Mary fought, drank and cursed with the best of them, proving again and again that piracy cared nothing for the rules of gender, only for courage and steel. When Rackham's ship was finally cornered by the British, most of his men were too drunk to resist. But not Anne and Mary. They fought ferociously to the last, pistols cracking, blades flashing, screaming at the cowering men around them to fight like they had. Captured and thrown in prison, both women escaped the noose by pleading pregnancy, their bellies sparing them from the hangman's rope, for a time at least. Anne vanished from history after that, perhaps escaping, perhaps dying in obscurity. Mary died of fever in prison, her body broken but her legend secured. And so the golden age of piracy flickered out, not with the eternal triumph its outlaws once dreamed of, but with betrayals, pardons, and scattered survivors. Woodes Rogers reclaimed Nassau, the Royal Navy hunted down the stragglers, and within a decade the black flags that once terrorized the Atlantic were gone. Yet the strange thing, the part that breaks the fourth wall, is that the pirates won in a way no empire ever could, because while Britain, Spain, and France erased their republics, they could not erase the stories. They could not kill the allure of men and women who lived free of kings and laws, who drank, fought, and died on their own terms. You feel it even now, don't you? That twinge of envy, that whisper asking what you would do if you were handed a cutlass, a pistol, and the promise of silver without end. And that is the true treasure of the golden age of piracy, not the chests of coins buried in sand or the ships burned on reefs, but the legend itself, the intoxicating idea that for a brief, impossible moment, there were men and women who answered to no one but themselves. And here's your outro hook. If you think this story is over, think again, because the seas are vast, the world is hungry for outlaws, and somewhere beyond the horizon, another black flag is always waiting to rise.